August 19, 1944. East Prussia, the pines around Wolfschanze damp with night and petrol. The paper maps under yellow lamps crease like old riverbeds. The air is cold enough to keep the cigarettes from curling. In a reinforced room where iron bolts hold timbers together, a staff officer totals figures in a margin and underlines them twice. Miles, gallons, tons. On the long table, the sweep of France hangs in colors and pins. The Allied arrows long and arrogant. The German countermarks stiff as a held breath. Alfred Jodl, the precise stylist of bad news, bends over the arithmetic that comforts experience. No army runs faster than its fuel. No column advances past its rations. No tank force eats distance without 20 wagons for each mile. History says so. Physics says so. Yet through the 100 miles of night between Wolfschanze and the ruins of Normandy, there is a different kind of music gathering. A sound that is not artillery or armor, not the swarming electricity of radios, but a low, endless drone-like weather. Engines stacked upon engines, gears turning in a rhythm no war college wrote down. A new instrument finding its note. That sound, an unbroken river of motor noise, is the symbol by which this story can be remembered. It is the underscoring beneath every milepost. It is the voice of a democracy that does not whisper. The battlefield map in East Prussia says what the professionals all know. The Allied breakout at St. Lo has become a rush across the open, and Third Army's vanguard, armored and hungry, is outpacing every plan printed in England. Patton's divisions burn fuel as fast as men can pour it, and their ammunition is a library of consumption. German staff calculations sharpen this truth with hard numbers. A Sherman gulps a half-mile per gallon on decent roads. An infantry division demands 700 tons every day. An armored division takes 1,000. The simple sum says 12,000 tons daily, hauled roughly 400 miles from beaches still stuttering with wreckage. Those numbers yield a conclusion as neat as a proof. Momentum must fail. Not for reasons of will, but for reasons of transport. The culmination point, the Clausewitzian stop, is not political or psychological. It is a gauge dropping to zero. The men in gray who invented speed as doctrine and were then betrayed by their own horses on Russian roads, recognize something familiar and, believing themselves wise, are reassured by it. They are wrong. The old rules will be overrun not by the elegance of a new tactic, but by the vulgarity of abundance. While Jodl's pencil clicks, 5,958 trucks are already climbing out of the hedgerow country and onto a route no one on the German general staff would ever have invented. An expressway devoted to war, one way out, one way back, lit against the night in defiance of every lesson about air attack. The convoys carry 12,500 tons each day, and within 3 days, those tons will become shells at the Seine. The German doctrine that invented operational art underlined concealment, husbanded vehicles like jewels, and trusted railways like arteries. Even in 1944, 4 of every 5 German tons moved behind the front is moved by a team of horses. The Wehrmacht built deep defensive sense upon the lesson that time will bring the enemy to a stop if we resist long enough. The American answer was a kind of blasphemy against that comfort. The answer was to turn roads into factories and trucks into conveyor belts. They called it red ball because railroads had once painted a red ball upon express freight that would not be stopped. Logo became doctrine. Starting on August 25, 1944, trucks in columns of 60 and 70 set off every 5 minutes from the Channel ports in Cherbourg, and they did not stop until they reached depots drawn by pencil on maps. 2 parallel lanes were chosen, one for full loads forward, one for empties returning. Military police manned checkpoints and pulled to the shoulder anything that fell below speed. Mechanics stood by like field surgeons every 50 miles and practiced triage upon the sick. 15 minutes to live, or into the ditch, cannibalized for another day's movement. Red Ball's rules looked like madness to any eye trained to the European art of keeping secrets. Headlights were not only used at night, they were ordered. Blackout discipline, iron law from the Somme to Kasserine, was stamped not applicable. If there was fog, engines went harder. If there were aircraft, there were not enough to make a difference. A speed of 35 miles an hour was not the goal, it was the floor. In the first week alone, August 25th to 31st, 89,939 tons were delivered, an average of 12,848 tons every day. The round trip for the trucks was about 686 miles, and the operation used 300,000 gallons just to move itself. A number that would have made a German supply officer laugh out loud if it had been presented before the first convoy rolled. But it was not presented, it was achieved. The convoys themselves were a pageant that ideological eyes could not fit into their frames. Of the 23,000 drivers who came to live by the tachometer, 3/4 were black soldiers who had been segregated in training and denied much of what Army life promised men who wore its uniform. They had stools they could not sit upon at home. In France, they drove for 20 hours out of 24, with names painted on the trucks that were half prayer and half dare. They built a culture inside the convoy, a code that did not need to be written. If you are slow, you pull aside. If the engine fails, you are hauled to the shoulder and made into parts. If a bridge is gone, you build a bypass and report it when it is already under your wheels. They called their vehicles what American soldiers always call their tools, with affection and irony, the deuce and a half, a 2.5-ton GMC CCKW walking on 6 wheels. German reconnaissance reported the phenomenon without understanding it. On August 28th, observation units sent home notes with the astonishment bled out. A continuous column, headlights visible for 20 kilometers, spacing abandoned, vulnerability assumed. An armored division commander watched a leg of the operation for an hour and admitted that the Americans were applying a kind of industrial logic to transport that did not care for elegance. He called it not military science, but mass production at work. He meant a factory had been extended across a captured country and turned on. The operation's heartbeat was louder than the sum of trucks. Fuel crossed the sea through Pluto, pipelines under the ocean, making an arithmetic of gasoline as stunning as the endless headlights. Along the road, fuel depots were set at 25-mile intervals, a string of metal tanks and hose lines under the shade. Not all of the miracle is pure velocity, much of it is hammer work. When a bridge washed away or was dropped by retreating Germans, engineers in green helmets and leather gloves threw rock into muddy beds and drove prefabricated metal spans into place without waiting for line drawings. The bridge at Monte-la-Jolie, meant to be a week-long pause, became a one-night interruption. In towns whose names the drivers would forget, maintenance parks sprayed wrenches and ideas all night. Engines were swapped in 45 minutes with cranes built to lift rail cars and repurposed with the bland confidence that everything in an American depot had a second life. If the exact part did not exist, the almost correct part was made to fit. If the owner's manual said no, the road said yes. The numbers, which the enemy first thought were posters' lies, settled onto ledgers as fact. By the first days of September, convoys were leaving every 5 minutes. Average trains 67 trucks, each commonly loaded to 5 tons, often adjusted to 7. Somewhere between 5,000 and 6,000 trucks were rolling at every moment of every day. To produce a 35-mile-per-hour average, you must waste vehicles that cannot keep up. To move 12,500 tons a day, you must accept dropping tons on the shoulder. To outrun the enemy's capacity to react, you must accept that men will drive past the safe point of fatigue. The enemy recognized the fracture in his understanding. A report to Army Group B says plainly that the enemy moved supplies with defiance of normal rules, calling the system incomprehensible. Field Marshal Model will later be quoted as saying the line that has become a shorthand for defeat, that it was not tanks or planes that beat him, but trucks. The men inside those cabs were time's hard apprentices. They swallowed Benzedrine to stretch the body's definition of a day and learned to feel the sidewalls of tires with feet through the floorboards. Accidents were the price of the plan. There were 300 dead by the time the main operation was done, yet the drivers said it was worth it for the satisfaction of making the impossible normal. They knew they were handling the one thing that made the front move. Patton's columns, once expected to stall, proved able to move again after lunch. On September 1st, the 4th Armored Division smashed ahead 67 miles in a single day, forcing German staffs to rewrite what they considered possible. General officers in East Prussia refused to believe the transmissions. They suspected misidentification of units or propaganda disguised as signals. It was none of those. It was a new logistics making a new language. The astonishment did not flow in one direction. French villages that had been starved of everything for 4 years watched the convoys paint their days with abundance. To children who had learned to live with ration cards and silence, a bar of chocolate handed out a cab window was a currency beyond money. Soap and cigarettes given for nothing destabilized what they had come to think of as the moral order. It was not only the gifts that mattered, it was the ease with which gifts were given. A truck did not become less capable by giving its surplus to a child. German intelligence wrote in September that hearts and minds along the route were moving to the other side with a speed that exceeded tanks, and that the convoys were talking louder than any propaganda hands could talk. Confession sounds different when written in the passive voice. Field marshals in captivity said that trucks had undone them. Staff officers wrote that they had prepared for everything, but not for that. The greatest tribute came from a number: 412,193 tons. A nation that could move that weight across a wounded country in 82 days had learned a power future enemies would reckon with. The German officer, for whom excellence meant parsimony and obedience, comes to understand that a free country can build in days a system a dictated state might build in years. He sees black soldiers, whom his books said were incapable of complex work, holding a nation's army in flight. He hears those engines echo over dark fields and recognizes at last that the noise is not simply noise. It is a language. It is the Republic speaking in machines. Freedom is prosaic like that, and victory can be too. Not only in the dash of the charge, but in the unromantic insistence of a convoy refusing sleep, grinding forward mile by mile until the math of war breaks.